Hi Matt, thanks for the introduction, and very happy to be here today with Regulation Asia again. So we're going to talk about in the next 45 minutes about data. Data is the key building block and foundation to satisfy the many stakeholder expectations around reporting. And today we'll discuss various aspects. We'll discuss the people, governance, data governance and ownership, the process aspects around the data enrichments and standards, and how can we use technology to also make use of data to provide insights. And as you can see here on the screen, we have a very strong panel. And let me do a very quick introduction. They can talk about more of their roles themselves during the discussion. Irene Liu, she is a Chief Governance and Reporting Officer of UnionDigital Bank in the Philippines, and Irene was a Big Four consulting partner and really a thought leader in the field of data governance. So we look forward to hearing from you, Irene. Feng-Yuan is the Vice President for Business Development of Aicadium. It's for those who don't know, it's an enterprise AI and machine learning tech company. And at the same time, Feng-Yuan has spearheaded many of the Smart Nation data initiatives for the Singapore government, and is actually currently working on the Monetary Authority of Singapore's NOVA project, which is to help financial institutions identify emerging environmental risks. So we're really looking forward to hearing from you around the technology side. And last but not least, my fellow academic and FTAHK FinTech Association board member, Brian Tang. He's the founding executive director of Hong Kong U's LITE Lab, and also a truly leading voice in RegTech. And by the way, congrats, Brian, on your recent award with getting the Clock Legal Innovation in Operations project. And I assume you were getting that in Vegas in May, so really envious of that. So we're looking forward to this panel. So let's get started. So for the next 45 minutes, let's start with from the basis with ESG data. So Irene, as you are a data governance expert, to you, what constitutes ESG data? How do we collect it? And what do you see as the ESG data challenges that we as an ecosystem need to address? Oh, I think you're on mute. Or maybe while Irene is working on her mic, maybe Brian or Feng-Yuan, can you share a bit more around? I know, Brian, you're part of the Edm Council. Can you share a bit more around your and Irene's role in the council and what you see as some of these ESG data challenges?
Sure. Thanks so very much for that, Lapman. Again, as you said, the data expert is Irene, so hopefully she'll be coming on board fairly soon. But first and foremost, thanks for the kind invitation. Maybe I can shed a little bit of color from my background and where I come from, so that it puts context in terms of the view. So before I was in the academy or involved in FinTech or RegTech, I was a US securities lawyer. So I did IPOs and bond offerings and worked with companies on annual disclosures to develop efficient capital markets. But I also did, project financing and infrastructure in Latin America, many of which have important ESG considerations. And way back when, even studied international environmental law and worked with the World Bank at NYU. But at Credit Suisse and then at ACMI, I was involved in the original consultation for the Hong Kong Stock Exchange under Mark Dickens, as it then was, on the Comply and Explain ESG disclosure regime, and even spoke at the UN Sustainable Stock Exchange kind of regional forum in Bangkok on climate disclosure. So it's really come a long way, and it's really great. So maybe let me set a few angles first. So why is disclosure important, right? So I moved from project finance to capital markets because the work applies to multiple industries and countries, right? So disclosure allows company board and senior management to focus on to measure and drive strategic decisions. Yet note that disclosure can be driven by regulatory requirements or by market forces, as was discussed in the last panel, right? Whether it's investors, consumers, or even reputational risk. And the great thing about disclosure, it's a positive feedback loop, right? So the more disclosure you have, the more investors have to consider for the investment decision or not, right? So there's a school of thought that investors say this is irrelevant stuff. But okay, fine, you disclose it. So it's up to the investors to make the decision. And then the more disclosure you have, the more it drives management decision making or not. So whether you think that you want to invest in certain industries like tobacco or fossil fuels or companies with links to Russia, as long as you have the disclosure, you make your own decision, right? Now comes the practical nuts and bolts. So if you're an issuer in a company, who is doing the sustainability and climate risk disclosure reports? Is it the CFO? Is it the corporate secretary or the general counsel? Is it the sustainability officer? Is it the chief data officer? Actually, the last one is the one that's normally not brought in, and that's part of the problem, right? So ESG is different, and we'll be hearing more from Irene in terms of her views on ESG, but ESG is different from financial data and financial audits because a lot of it includes external data and new sources of data. So you need new skill sets, new mindsets, new frameworks, especially with respect to data analytics. And so that's why I'm pleased to actually be part of the Edm Council and the APAC ESG working group. And that's how I worked with, I got to meet with Irene. So hopefully this, so I think, is Irene back on now?
Oh, okay. I think we still have technical issues, maybe a setting. And right. While we work on that, maybe we'll move to Feng-Yuan, given that we're talking now about a technology problem. How can emerging technologies like AI and big data, analytics, blockchain help address some of the ESG data challenges that we're seeing out there, all the way from sourcing data through the Internet of Things and satellites, through distribution of the data for blockchain, translating the data into metrics and reports for companies' decision-making and comparison. Any views or real-life case studies? I think people are most interested in terms of really what is happening on the ground and what we can expect down the road around this.
Yeah, no, that's a great question, a lot to answer. And maybe let me also give some context about what I do in Aicadium and what Aicadium is. So Aicadium is a software company focused on the use of data science and machine learning. We're Temasik's AI Center of Excellence. And, we're looking to co-develop, game-changing new products in the areas of, sustainable finance as well as in other sectors. We're a very mission-driven company, so sustainable finance, the intersection of that and AI and technology is obviously something very close to our hearts collectively. Now, my involvement in ESG is part of the NOVA initiative, which was started by the Monetary Authority of Singapore, as well as a consortium of banks and technology providers. And the starting point is really, with a landscape where there's a lot of fragmented data, lack of standards, how do we build better utilities, data utilities, right, to enable better reporting, better transparency, and that can kind of unlock a lot more in terms of what can be done in whether it's reporting, monitoring, or financing, right? So I think about it from how do you make the entire process, for example, for underwriting a green loan or SLL, like how do we make that a lot easier? Because obviously you rely on disclosures, you rely on somebody, as we talked about, making that report. But can we automate that process? And as a data scientist, I always think about alternative sources of data, right? Don't rely on a human being, but IoT is now getting cheaper, so you can put sensors in a plantation, right, to measure the amount of CO2 or measure other derivative data points, which allows you to then use machine learning to infer the amount of CO2 in the environment. So that's really the premise, and you can extend it to different industries. So, for example, in some industries, Scope 2 emissions are of greatest relevance. So rather than relying on some poor soul in the company to kind of report electricity and water consumption, might it not be possible to, using APIs, integrate that data from the electricity grid or get it from a building management systems provider? Obviously, you need to seek consent from the building owner or the company, But if there's a way to automate this process, use back-end data systems to smoothen that process, and there are the right incentives, as there are now, for companies to be a lot more transparent, to provide a verifiable at-source continuous data, then I think that gets very exciting, right? I come from a world where you've got data from software streaming in microseconds and milliseconds. So this idea of reporting on KPIs and SPTs every year seems really foreign to me, right? That this should be what we aspire to, that we get metrics on a much more kind of continuous basis. So that's kind of broadly the space I sit in. I think there's a lot of obviously hype around artificial intelligence. Typically, AI is most effective when you have tons of data. So if you don't have, the problem is lack of data, then maybe trying to generate ESG risk scores with AI is for now, maybe not the first thing to look at. But you can think about using AI to structure data. So looking at satellite images of plantations or drone images and trying to understand, for example, the effect of certain carbon mitigation programs. All that you could potentially do without sending a person there, but with that stream of video images, use AI to quantify. So I like to say, in a world where there isn't enough data, then use AI to do data processing on your unstructured data, right? On your images, your videos, using natural language processing to extract information from documents. So that's where I see the immediate potential for AI. So I can talk a lot more about other technologies, but let me stop there and hand the time back to Lapman.
No, thanks for sharing. I think that sounds good. And while we wait for Irene to get back on, maybe we'll move a little bit more from some. Now we've seen that there are these emerging technologies.
No, Irene is on, but can you hear us, Irene? Can we hear you? You're on mute right now, apparently. Sorry.
Yeah. So while we're still working on that, let's move to the next part, and then we'll leave Irene for the very nice last bit in the end. So now we're having emerging technologies. There, Feng-Yuan talked about ways to access alternative data. So there is a lot of data out there, structured, unstructured data. There's technology to make sense out of it, but at the same time, in the life cycle, from getting it to the end user reader like ourselves, there are many of these ESG reporting frameworks like CDP, PRI, TCFD, and standards out there like GRI, Issb. Brian, can you share more around what you see in this space, given your legal governance experience over the years? Where do you see it's going? Where do you see, how do people use it now? Interested in your views, Brian.
Sure. So thanks, Lapman. Again, we heard a lot of great sharings at our last panel already, but maybe let me try to contextualize it a little bit. And I personally think it's such a great time to be alive if you're into this space, right? So Ashley Alder, who's the IOSCO chair and also the chair of the SFC here in Hong Kong, has actually called it an alphabet soup, right? There's so many acronyms out there. But I think importantly, if you take a step back, one needs to distinguish between sustainability in general and then climate risk. You distinguish between frameworks and then standards. And then some of these are coming from the private sector. Some of them are coming from NGOs, and some of them are intergovernmental, right? Then you also need to think about, a lot of these public company disclosure standards, and there are nuances between the different countries that come out. So again, I used to be an IPO lawyer. So if I were doing an IPO of a Chinese company listed in the US versus listed in Hong Kong, there was a difference in disclosure, right, in terms of length and detail, because one has a sponsor regime, the other one has an underwriter due diligence regime. So there are nuances in the different jurisdictions. And then, what are the main issues? The issues are like, if you're and this is linked to one of the questions that came about, I think on the chat, which is, for a disclosure for a company, what level should you do? And then from an investor, which you heard a lot from the last panel, how do you compare apples to apples, right? Or as the SEC chair says it, how do we make it consistent and comparable? Because ultimately, if you're an investor, you want to be consistent and comparable. And then how do you address issues of greenwashing, right? As you heard earlier on, a lot of the reports became pretty pictures, right? So ESG data is not the same as financial data, right? So financial data traditionally has been from the books and records. There's an auditor and an audit and accounting regime. So you have questions as to, as what was alluded to, what data is collected, right? What is the quality of the data, and is it fit for purpose? Because data that's collected for one particular purpose may not be actually fit for another, right? So somebody, to the example, if I have IoT to actually do inventory checking, right, to maintain the level's inventory, if I use that data for another purpose, is that appropriate? How's the data calibrated or benchmarked compared to data from industry, i.e. third parties or from competitors? So within the accounting space, you've got the when there are two main standards, right? So when I was doing a US listing, it's a US GAAP. And then if you're doing most of the international listing, it's all under IFRS, right? So these are main accounting standards. The exciting news of sorts is that, now the accounting standards are saying, look, rather than having a lot of these other frameworks, the accounting boards are now saying, look, why don't we make these accounting-like standards for sustainability and climate disclosure. So in November of 2021, IFRS established the Issb, the International Sustainability Board's Sustainability Standards Board. But then there are various questions in terms of the direction towards companies having, So actually, this is a great thing for a lot of us who do believe of the importance of climate, because it points that companies now who previously had a single bottom line to go towards maybe a double bottom line. So one of the criticisms against shareholder capitalism is that, it doesn't account for externalities, right? So if it's not on the balance sheet, it's irrelevant to the role of the company and the board and its management, who all owe a fiduciary duty to maximize returns to shareholders. But now you have these criteria which can perhaps apply not just to shareholders, but also perhaps to stakeholders. So I think the way to think about it is this: there are two types of disclosure, and people mix it up a lot. So one is climate risk, right? Climate risk is frankly something lawyers and accountants have a background in drafting risk factors. So a lot of it is, how does it impact financial performance? So Bloomberg is the one that actually set forth, Michael Bloomberg, the man, and the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosure, the TCFD that has been mentioned, and that together with the greenhouse gas protocol have really been some of the more accepted climate risk disclosures that have been introduced, right, in terms of frameworks and the like. So in November 2021, the Hong Kong Stock Exchange issued a guidance on climate disclosure. And then in March 2020 of this year, March 21, the SEC actually proposed new rules for the enhancement and standardization of climate-related disclosure. So now U.S. companies listed in the U.S. might have to disclose climate risk. Okay, so that's a big thing. And I think they pipped it just before the ISSB on March the 13th issued their proposed new climate-related disclosures. So now both of these are actually under consultation, right? So I actually have a copy of the SEC one, right? The SEC one is here, and there's 200 pages more. But this is the ISSB consultation report, which is due on July 29th. So everybody who's interested in this and want to have views on this, please do send your submissions. So that's climate risk. Then there's sustainability, but sustainability opens a whole can of worms, as was discussed in the last panel, because people call it ESG, right? Environment, social, and governance. But which aspect do you focus on more, right? So if you're a European company, the EU just passed again, it was mentioned briefly in the last panel, the CRSD, which is a corporate reporting sustainability directive that was passed in April of last year. And so they are anticipating the European sustainability reporting standards. So if you're a European company, you are now subject to that. But ISSB has now proposed, again, a second consultation paper, this time on sustainability. And again, it was issued on the same day as the climate one, and the consultation finished on the same thing, same day, July 29. So a lot of us will have a busy summer reviewing and giving comments on this, right? And a lot of that is sector focus, as was mentioned earlier on, but it raises lots of really interesting and practical questions. So should this disclosure be single or dual materiality? So most of the financial-based approach is to say, look, you only need to make it, is it material for an investor, right? But the European approach is actually a dual materiality. So is it material for other stakeholders like employees, right, and the environment? should it only apply to listed companies? So again, the SEC one and the IFRS ones generally are listed companies, but the European one applies to large companies, not just listed companies, right? There are details to be looked at in terms of the differences. So should employee compensation be somehow linked to this? And to what extent should we have external attestation? So, the examples that was raised earlier on in terms that Feng-Yuan raised was you have these data points, right? Whether internal or external, but the idea is to get an external party to verify. So, more money and good news for the big four and new kind of service providers who might be doing the limited assurance or even audit standards. But what level would that be, right? And how would that be verified? So new approaches need to be thought about it, and all this does cost money. So I personally had experience. So when we do listings in Hong Kong, there's a requirement for internal controls, and that's linked to a COSO standard. And so often we would need that limited assurance from an auditor or a consultant to do that. And there's always a discussion, who assumes the risk? What is the process that's actually driven? And it gets complicated, as was discussed in the earlier panel as well, regarding whether you're more principles-based or taxonomy-based, whether you're in developing market versus developed market. So it's a great time where I think while there has been an alphabet soup, I think increasingly there's a more harmonization, yes. But now as we get into the details, now we have to roll up our sleeves a little bit more.
Got it. No, thanks for sharing it. So we're moving in the right direction, but still a lot of work to be done to operationalize, allocate the risk, etc. Good news, Irene is back, both video and voice. And
so Irene,
there's no worries, technical issues. So I think just maybe we'll ask. I still want to know from your experience, what do you see as more of the broader ESG data challenges? And maybe at the same time, I know that you work with many of the Singaporean banks on BCPS239, the principles for effective risk data aggregation reporting. And can we apply some of these BCPS239 principles to data governance, data quality controls, and data validation to move the needle forward? So it's basically two questions. Really looking forward to hearing.
Lapman, you have just opened a can of worms by asking what are the ESG challenges, right? So maybe let me start off by saying exactly what is ESG data. Now, academically, I can define ESG data as being data that is used to, report, manage, and mitigate the ESG risks. Now, this is an academic kind of what I call a definition. However, what does it mean in practice? Now, this is the fun part. Because just now, Brian, has talked about, the effervescence, the growth of a number of, ESG regulations, the guidelines, the reporting requirements. So give just a very simple example, E, S, and G. So just talking about the S in itself, social. And in fact, I've been reading a few of these sustainability reports in last year's annual report, right, provided by our banks. Now, it's very interesting when they always talk about S. People are always talking about gender diversity, or how many males and females do we have within the organization across like geography and so on. But is that really the objective of the S itself? Are we looking at perhaps providing equal opportunities? Now, if let's say providing equal opportunities is really the end game, then the number of employees is probably split by gender is probably not enough. We may also want to look at, for example, in terms of the pay gap by the gender. We may also want to look at diversity in terms of the racial mix that we're hiring as well. So then, therefore, it comes down to what is the objective of our ESG strategy? And therefore, it comes down to what do we want to measure? Therefore, coming down to data challenges. In fact, you're talking about data challenges and giving me a good opportunity to mention this, right? So we have been looking at, if we want to be able to collect ESG data, where do we collect them from? And this is, I'm speaking more from a Southeast Asia perspective. I'm actually working on the ASEAN Bankers Association Interoperable Data Framework Task Force. And in fact, this is actually about data sharing across the 10 countries. And when we were looking at a use case on sharing of data, so one of the use cases that was brought up was ESG. So we said, okay, let's look at whether or not, in the first place, to be able to share the data, we need to be able to collect the data, make sure it's of good quality, is stored in a digital format so that before we can share. Unfortunately, when we were doing a survey across the 10 countries, the representative banks that came back, it was an appallingly low rate of which the ESG data was being collected. Now, this is of course symptomatic of the fact that, at the ground level, at the SMEs level, at the corporates level, are they collecting such information so that the banks can actually house such information? So that's what I see as one of the key, in fact, the primary, I would call it the primary data challenge, which is not even available in the first instance. So, and therefore we have this big issue, right? So then the next thing you're talking about is BCPS239, in terms of how it applies to data management. BCPS239 is my favorite topic. So if we were going to talk about, if assuming we now have data, okay, and perhaps, we can purchase the data from all the data providers, the data aggregators. Then the next thing is, so what is, how are we going to manage this data? And in fact, people are looking at ESG data and providing it, externally, or rather, reporting this information in disparate formats. So let us look at, the key requirements of BCPS239 is about, good quality of data, transparency over the so-called life cycle of the data, through to independent assurance, and of course, reporting, which is fit for purpose. Now, if we just look at these 4 key things, right? So first of all, do we know what data do we need to collect to ensure that it's fit for purpose? So it was mentioning about what I was referring to earlier. The second thing is transparency. Now, I like to use the word transparency in the fact that, what is transparency in terms of the flow of data? We're talking about the flow of data, drawn out in a data flow diagram, in a data lineage. Now, transparency is very important. I don't want to undermine that, although it's a very tedious process, right, to be able to draft up these documents. And the reason is because we know, right, just now we talk about, there are multiple reporting requirements. We talk about the so-called the UN, sustainability governance requirements. We talk about the TCFD requirements. We talk about the, SASB requirements as well. So there's just a mouthful of things that we need to comply with. Yet the underlying data elements may actually be the same. It's just that the metrics itself may be slightly different, and the reporting also may be slightly different as well. So knowing where your data comes from, having that assurance over the data model is important to us. Then finally, of course, reporting the metrics, which is of course, fit for those, reportable requirements that we need to. So I'll pause there. Thank you.
No, thank you for sharing it. I'm looking at Feng-Yuan and Irene yourself. Thanks for sharing that. I mean, there's so much data out there. Some data might need to be cleansed or enriched. Do you have some practical advice for the audience how you can use technology or data governance standards, etc.? So if I'm just a company, I'm seeing all these frameworks and standards. I select the ones that I want to focus on, but then I find out, okay, in-house data, external data, then I find out there are data gaps and challenges. Practically, what can I do as a company other than saying, oh, don't have this, don't have that? Is there any practical advice?
There's no magic to this, right? I mean, at the end of the day, I think what Irene said was spot on, right? You need to be clear about what you're measuring, why you're measuring it. No metric it will be absolutely perfect. But I think what we want to see is greater interest in capturing these metrics, right? Even systematically, doing this within your organization. And most companies that I've seen will already have some sort of data management, back-end technology, but that's not the problem. It's not the kind of IT problem, so to speak, right? The kind of data we're talking about, the technology exists to handle this big data. It's not that it's massive. It's just that it's not well defined, not well standardized, right? How do you calculate these metrics? What's the coverage? As you're making measurements or estimations, what assumptions are being made? All this tends to be not well captured or documented. So to some extent, I think it will be an iterative process, right? As these things always go, right? You have some leaders who demonstrate best practice. You have regulations and standards. But also, what's interesting about ESG is I don't think it's so clear cut as to what metrics make sense, right? Especially maybe it's easier in E, but in S and G, and then is standardization? Does standardization even make sense, right? So these are age-old problems that have been faced before in other sectors. So I think we're just the technology is there. I don't think the problem is inherently technology.
Got it. So we need to search and find to work on that. Irene, when you were off, I mentioned your and Brian's role at the Edm Council. In that respect, do you have any initiatives at the Edm Council that can help with this question around cleansing, enriching?
This is a very good question. So I'm not sure whether or not the audience here knows about the Edm Council. Have they been introduced to Edm Council already, Lapman?
No. So please do share.
So let me introduce a bit about the Edm Council and the work we do, and then I'll see how that actually reconciles back to what you were asking, right? So the Edm Council is actually a global so-called association that is actually aimed at inculcating the best practices in data management and also to provide data standards and also training and certification to the data professionals. So in the work that they do on ESG, in fact in January they were actually producing this research paper on ESG data management, rating providers and data aggregators, whereby they were looking at what are the key issues that the data providers and the rating agencies were facing, and what were some of the recommendations to resolve some of these issues. But more importantly, I think on your question on how AI technology has been used, right? So in COP27 this year, so the Edm Council has been tasked with providing two pieces of work and outputs to the committee itself. The first stream of the work was to look at how AI can be used to support the mapping of the data taxonomy and the requirements. So that's the first one, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. The second one is, of course, on the data challenges underpinning the industry, like what we are talking about today. And that one will be doing a kind of a global survey centered around APAC, Europe, and also in Americas as well. And that we are partnering with LITE Lab, Brian's team of students who's helping us with that on the APAC level. Now, just going back on the first work stream. So what we're looking at is, a growth of the number of the different kinds of data taxonomies that's available. They are 70% similar, 30% different. And yet, if you think about a global organization like a Citibank's HSBC Stand Chart, right, that is required to comply with the multiple regulations across multiple jurisdictions. Now, that itself will be a compliance nightmare. So what we're looking at is to be able to use AI technology to be able to ingest this data taxonomy and to look at, how, if let's say we're ingesting this data taxonomy, what are the commonalities back to the data elements itself. And then, therefore, once you have that mapping available, you can very quickly say that, okay, this data element is able to help you to, come up to the data taxonomy and therefore the reporting requirements for this particular, report. Now, then it gives you a very quick view as to what are the reportable elements whereby the data is actually missing. And therefore, you can then look at, within your organization, right, what is the strategy to procure those data. So that's where the use of AI comes in very handy.
No. Thanks, Irene, for sharing that. I want to talk a little bit around, given that there is so much that needs to be done. I'm hearing more of these ecosystem public-private partnership. Feng-Yuan, I'm interested also in your view as you worked at many of these public-private data initiatives. Can you share a bit what of the challenges and lessons learned that you have seen in your journey spearheading some of these initiatives, more for our audience to take on?
Yeah, when you're trying to do, collaborations with data, it immediately gets tricky, right? Because it's all about the data governance, as was discussed before, handling data sharing. What are the regimes and the protocols for sharing data? And especially when you bridge public and private, sometimes there are different approaches and different levels of risk and levels of concern. Now, in my view, the technology is there to help mitigate risks of data privacy, right? So there are techniques now to anonymize data, to mask it, to aggregate it. So I always say that but the only way to tread this trade-off is to be quite clear about how you want to use data. Now, this is slightly different from what was quite popular back in the day when it was the promise of big data was just give me all your data and I'll tell you something, right? And that's not very good if you need to do data sharing and you want to fuse data from public-private sources. That tends to, I think, run too many risks of data breaches and privacy issues. So my practical guidance is always, if you want to combine data sets, the technologies are there, but be clear about how you want to use that data. And so you can kind of manage the scope and the risks arising from privacy. So I think that's one piece. And I think secondly, whenever there's data sharing, there's a lot of downside risks for the data contributor, and so there's not always an alignment of incentives. So think about how we can bring everyone on the table and there's value for everyone. That's not always monetary, but again, whenever you think about data sharing, there's always this asymmetric risk, right? The value may be accrued more by one party, and the party contributing data is all the downside risk. So those are the two things I always think about when you're trying to structure some of these initiatives.
Thanks. That's fair. Okay, Brian.
And then if I can just briefly add to that, to add to the complexity, besides the data privacy, which, again, 10, 15 years ago, nobody talked about that, right? It's all about big data. Now we've got also the concept of data sovereignty, data going across borders, right? So that adds to the even extra complexity as we try to do more, and hence the challenges of Irene's project there that she had mentioned. But I think it becomes more important as we all appreciate, when we're looking at the climate, for goodness sake, it's the planet, right? You can't, and we're talking a lot of the organizations here are multinational companies. So they act.
No one's moving the data to Mars.
Exactly. Right? So not yet, right? Elon will soon. So the thing is so I think we must find ways, for commonalities, right? So we must focus on the 70% that Irene said, so that we start with the commonalities, and then there will be hard cases. As Feng-Yuan said, we have to work through it and iterate, but hopefully focus on the commonalities rather than the differences.
No, thanks for sharing that. I mean, we talked about technologies, we talked about data, and I want to talk a little bit more around the data, ESG data providers, score and rating agencies for a bit more. I mean, we all know that compared to the debt rating agencies, it's a much simpler picture with debt ratings. We have the S&Ps, Moody's, Fitch. Ratings are not more than 1-2 notches different, but it's a different world if you look at ESG rating agencies. There are many out there. I'm sure you know, MSCI, Moody's, etc. Can I ask? Maybe I'll start with Brian, more from a legal and compliance perspective. What do you see the role of these ESG data rating agencies and providers in the broader ecosystem, and how can they meet providing the demand for quality ESG data? Can you share a bit more around it before I move to the other?
Sure, I'll try to be brief on this. So again, I used to be in international bonds, right? So so I'm used to dealing with rating agencies, and I joke about a love-hate relationship, right? So on the one hand, yes, there's only a few notches that they have as differences, but somehow they always come out late. So after the Evergrande, default, then they downrate it. Or when I was doing onshore kind of bonds in China, they rated everything really highly compared to offshore. So even then, there's a distinction, right? And that's just in bonds. But then that being said, when I started doing unrated bonds, I missed them because there's no adult in the room to actually force some standards, right? So there was no standards when it was unrated. So now you come to ESG and it becomes even more complicated. I think, the way to think about it potentially in capital markets is this, rating agencies are a shortcut way for investors to do less diligence to say, look, because this is tick the box, I can do that. So I don't need to spend a lot of time and effort in the diligence. Now, the complexity is with the E, as we talked about, the E and the S and the G. So maybe if there's just an E rating agency, then it makes sense. I know what that means, right? The G maybe, because now some of the ESG funds that invested in Russia and said Russia was good are a little bit in trouble, right? The S, as Irene mentioned, gets very complicated in our diverse world. So I think there will be a role. I wonder whether they'll end up focusing on certain niche markets. So you go to different rating agencies for different ones because you trust certain ones more than others. That's my initial thoughts.
Thanks. Irene, any views on this?
Well, I have something very interesting to share, right? And it was just when we were talking to the Cambridge professor, Professor Pedro Seffi. He did a bit of a research last year, and he was looking at the multiple rating agencies, right, on ESG scoring. And so he was then tabulating them according to whether or not they were well correlated and how closely correlated they were. In fact, the interesting outcome was that in fact he found that majority of these ESG credit ratings some of them were inversely correlated to one another, which means to say, if let's say in one agency they were relating it, scoring as being very good, in fact in another agency they were scoring as poor. And so this actually scoring guideline, right? Gave me a bit of a so-called insights. What is actually causing this kind of a divergence, right? Because you mentioned earlier, when it's coming down to credit scoring, there's a lot more convergence. But whereas in terms of ESG rating, there's a lot more divergence in place to the extent that, in fact, they're even conversely proportionate. So therefore, the underlying is because, number one, there is not sufficient so-called guidance in terms of what is industry standard as yet. in terms of what is, first of all, the underlying data elements that's required to be input. Number two is the data model in itself, and hence the disparity in the ratings. So in fact, my joke is always, right, if I were to be able to draw a crystal ball, and you don't even need a crystal ball to do that, in due course, give it another 2 to 3 years more time. The maturity of the model will be such that there will be a convergence in the way we are going to, have these models, and therefore a convergence in terms of the rating agencies as well. But until such time, I think the banks are at their free will to choose whichever rating agencies that serves them best.
Got it. Thanks for sharing that view, Irene. We had different panels entirely around this topic, also with our previous panelist, Gabriel, around this at length. Maybe let's, we have a couple more minutes to do. So we have ESG disclosure. I think I want to talk with Brian about what happens if you don't get your ESG disclosures right, in terms of, is there a clear and present risk or danger of ESG litigation seeing here in Asia or in Hong Kong, and any views?
So again, this is me wearing the legal hat, right? So that's why we like it, and that's why from a RegTech point of view, that's why I call some of the technologies, ESG technologies, RegTech, because it's really now regulatory compliance. Because when there's regulatory compliance, people invest in the time and effort to it. But once it's actually disclosed, some interesting things happen, right? Because you've now disclosed it, and under most regulatory disclosure regimes, you are liable for any material misstatements or omissions in your disclosure. So now, if whether it is from an investor's point of view or from a stakeholder's point of view, right? So somebody may complain to the regulator, say, well, hang on, they misdisclosed, and therefore the regulator may come after you, and that's probably what tends to happen in Asia, which is very much regulatory focused. But I also spend time in the US, right, where it's the shareholders, right, and class action lawsuits. So they actually, climate change litigation is actually becoming a thing, and the people distinguish that between the US and globally, and so this is being tracked at Columbia University and by LSE as well. And one of the quotes is that globally, cumulative number of climate change related cases have more than doubled since 2015. So just over 800 cases were filed in 2080, from 1986 to 2014, while over 1,000 have been brought in the last 6 years. So this is kind of a real thing that can be happening. More disclosure means great for investors, but also if you don't meet it, i.e. you greenwash, you say how great everything is, and it goes around. Not only do you have regulators potentially coming against you, especially in Asia, but if you have exposure elsewhere and investors elsewhere, you may have class action lawsuits as well.
Just very insightful. So I think there's both a stick and a carrot approach. Well, there's a stick here, but at the same time, in my interviews or research, I found that key stakeholder constituents do want companies to take a stand through their disclosures of what they want to do from a positive stick and a carrot approach. So what leads us to the last couple of minutes, I want to ask each of you maybe for what is a key takeaway for the audience? Is there a call for action for your own initiatives? Any future prediction? Feng-Yuan, anything from you? As a key
I think the intersection of ESG and technology will be fascinating, but it will take many years, right? I mean, people get very excited about where technology is going to drive change. I think it will take many years, but as a data scientist, I'm excited about the possibilities of better, more transparency, right? In terms of performance, and I think over time, as regulators get on board, as companies and as younger people, demand this, I think we'll see a situation where we won't have this poor data from the ratings agency that Brian was talking about, right? It wouldn't be just based on timing, because all that data will be much more readily available, much more verifiable. That's the kind of vision that I see.
Great, thanks. Irene?
Well, I've just got 2 quotes to share. Begin with the end in mind, and don't let perfection be the enemy of good. So what I mean by, begin with the end in mind is, what is your ESG strategy? Now, just don't follow the crowd, right? I mean, the whole industry is all talking about ESG. But what is exactly the ESG strategy of the organization? And each one of the organizations will have a different gap. And therefore, you talk about, therefore, what data do you want to collect? So then why do we say that, don't let perfection be the enemy of good, right? Because we know that there's a lot of data elements that we need to collect, data models that we need to look at. We need to start from somewhere. the thing is, where do we start from? So use an agile approach, pilot it, collect the data, and don't just blindly follow what industry does. Or rather, we do something good, but suitable within the organization, than just blindly follow what others are doing.
Great. No, thanks for sharing that. The industry needs a lot of coaches and experts like yourself. Brian?
So as you may know, I do a lot of work in the RegTech space. And right now, one of our initiatives is upskilling in the RegTech mindsets and skill sets. Right. So with RegTech mindsets and skill sets, you need compliance officers who now understand technology and data and the new emerging technologies to actually address regulatory needs and compliance. But with ESG tech, or whatever you want to call this, it gets even more complicated, because now you've got ESG and sustainability professionals who are not traditionally compliance professionals, so not traditionally technology professionals, but they now bring their domain expertise and knowledge into the space. So I think it's the same kind of advice I give to the general RegTech space, but now broaden for the ESG and sustainability space. So strengthen and develop the right mindsets and skill sets, and be willing and able to collaborate with colleagues and professionals with different domain expertise, right? So whether you come from the compliance side, or you come from the sustainability side, you come from the IT/data/ML side, right? Be willing and able to work and prototype and test new ways forward, so that because only then can we develop some of the end states that Feng-Yuan and Irene have talked about. Because without the right people all coming together and having an open set mindset and skill set, that's not going to happen.
Got it. No, definitely people and talent are key in that, and as academics are also important in that, giving yourselves and myself, we are providing talent, we're providing the studies, etc. So with that, really, I want to thank everyone for joining us today, the audience, Irene, Brian, and Feng-Yuan, for sharing your insights.